Ginger and pray for her. But I also had, get my notes out, Carrie Davison. Do you remember Carrie? Well, apparently, Carrie Davison's parents were married by P.B. Hill in her grandparents' home, which is downtown, and because her mother didn't want to get married in the church, and I didn't ask that story, but I don't know that any pastor would do, at least recent pastors would probably not do weddings outside of the church or outside of a church setting. And Carrie was born about a year later and has been involved in the church her whole life. And so her parents were married by P.B. Hill, and she thought we would be interested in hearing that. And I'm sure you are. And that I was actually driving to the office, and my car has good Bluetooth, and so I was talking to Virginia on my way in, and she was giving me a little lowdown. Virginia's doing well. I haven't seen her, but I've talked to her numerous times on the phone, and she was on the search committee when I came to interview. So that was like 9 years ago. So it was good to talk with her. Today we have Anna Armstrong, who is granddaughter of P.B. Hill. And P.B. Hill, haven't done my homework. I should have done some homework. P.B. Hill was early on in the pastoral history of our church, and she will share that with us. Has a lot of pictures, and I want to give her as much time as possible to get through. And I've asked her to focus on his work here and her experience of being the granddaughter of the pastor. Now, you were what, 5 years old? Okay. So and that was how long had he been pastor in your lifetime at that point?
He was not pastor not during my lifetime.
Mm-hmm.
He was pastor from 1921 to 1940.
Okay.
And then he went to Victoria after the war and was pastor there for another 5 years or so.
Well, we're glad to have you with us. Thank you for being willing to come and share. Want to give you as much time as possible, and you will be staying for lunch, correct?
She'll be staying for lunch.
So she'll be here with us, and you can ask questions. Anna, thank you for being here. Welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Pastor Joe. It's always a privilege to be in this church and to speak of my grandfather, who had such a profound influence on this church and in the city of San Antonio. When I gave this address to the women of the church legacy luncheon, it took me 55 minutes before we even got to San Francisco to get them across the Pacific. So I promise you it's not going to be that long. There will be photos, but not that many. So anyway, this is an introduction that gives you an idea of his overall persona. And this is from the book by Green Peyton Wertenbaker, who was his nephew-in-law. Here was a man of simple grace, as Luke and Timothy. People turned to him as other men turned to the disciples, and for the same reasons. That a pilgrim of this type should turn up on the sun-baked plains of Texas was not in and of itself surprising. However, it was surprising that P.B. Hill became the spiritual guide to a host of hot-eyed Texans. He was a gentle man, and Texans, historically, are rarely gentle. Remember the bromide, Texas is hell on women and horses. He was an inveterate storyteller, and Texans are notable for their silence and reticence. Texans live in a state of intimacy with death, forgotten by peoples of softer regions. They spend much time alone with their own thoughts on the wide plains under an inscrutable heaven. They internalize their thoughts on eternal topics alone on the high desert of West Texas and respond more readily to righteousness than men whose minds are occupied with matters more trivial. Texans also know they often stand in need of repentance and forgiveness or absolution. Think back to the Reverend Brother John Kaiser's Ash Wednesday meditation. Here begins the story of P.B. Hill. You can give us the first slide, please. The family came from Oxfordshire in 1642, and that's the family of Hills that arrived. Robert Hill Sr. and Robert Hill Jr. moved from Suffolk to Richmond with Robert Jr.'s wife, Evelyn Gay Bernard. And they had Robert Hill was a wonderful businessman, both the father and the son. They had developed a line of canal boats that ran merchandise up the York and James rivers. However, they heard that real estate opportunity was even more lucrative in the Richmond area. So they moved to Richmond and took on different enterprises there that were very successful. They were patrons of the arts, with Evelyn Gay Bernard Hill, P.B.'s mother, being a fine pianist, and she could have become professional at any time. Of all the five children, Leonidas Parker, Edwin Forrest, Vernon Lee, Pierre Bernard Hill, and Evelyn Lee Hill, baby sister, he was the only one that had musical talent. He had a fine baritone and could play the Italian mandolin and the banjo. He tended to be a bit on the frail side, and because of that frailty, his parents felt it best to just let him wander, let him do what he wanted to, and more or less as he pleased. And he was born March 4th of 1877, and this was 12 years after the end of the Civil War and 7 years after the death of General Robert E. Lee. So the effects of Reconstruction were still very present, but Richmond was not in bad shape at all, considering. And he was able to go down to the Confederate veterans' home, and he visited for hours with them. And he also rode Old Sorrel, who was Stonewall Jackson's old horse, that after General Jackson's death was put out to pasture at the Confederate veterans' home along with the other gentlemen who were the last survivors of the lost cause. P.B. attended, his education was rather desultory, and he went to Elba Public School periodically. But most of the time he was just outdoors and had a wonderful time that way. Lots of fresh air and sunshine. Evelyn Gay Bernard, interestingly enough, was descended from French Huguenots. Let's see. You could give us the next slide. Sorry again. Is there any way to get that up on that screen? Thank you. The mother was of French Huguenot descent, and they were also people of letters. Her father owned the Southern Planter, which is a farm journal that's still in print today. And Miss Gay, his grandmother's father, was Mr. Charles White, that owned the Southern Literary Messenger, which was a wonderful literary paper, and the wonderful contributing editor to this magazine was Edgar Allan Poe. And Mr. White worked with Mr. Poe for quite some time, trying to help him with his alcoholism and his heroin addiction and everything else that he had. Let's see. However, the world began for P.B. Hill in 1888. P.B.'s father and several other enterprising businessmen invested in the World Exposition, which was held at Richmond. And that's where P.B. got his first taste of business acumen. There was a barker there who advertised that he had the devil's child or something, which actually turned out to be made of paper mache. But there was this great story that Dr. Knox, I think was the snake oil doctor, who was running the show, and he said that this woman had, an itinerant Bible salesman had gone to the door of this pregnant lady and tried to sell her a Bible, and she said, "Oh, go to hell, I'd sooner have the devil." And so supposedly she was cursed and delivered of this little pagan creature with horns and cloven hooves and a tail. However, we do note that said devil child was paper mache. So, but when Dr. Knox tired of this, he handed off the role to PB, and he says, "My voice is tired. Young man, you take over." And PB would start smacking the canvas with the cane, with Dr. Knox's cane, saying, "Hurry, hurry, hurry, see the world-famous devil child." And eventually, Dr. Knox did not show up one day. Not only had he run off with one of the young ladies, but more importantly, the week's receipts. So at that point, PB's father took over that particular act, hired a barker, paid the barker, and pocketed the proceeds himself. Much better option. His education did take up again. He realized when he was about 13 that he was going to have to do something to better himself. So he studied for 2 years at a private school to fill in the gaps, and he studied Latin and algebra with a tutor. He learned German on his own. The man was super intelligent to be able to take on a very sophisticated language like German. And he had an interest in science. And at that time, all of the scientific and medical journals and newsletters were published in German, the Zeitschriften. And so he sat down with a dictionary and asked questions of his tutors, and he learned enough German to read these journals about electricity and physics. And he went to night school at the Mechanics Institute for a year, where he studied physics, electrical physics, and accountancy, and he became a CPA at the end of that year. So he had a means of supporting himself. And Dr. Wright, who was a Main Street dentist there in Richmond, needed a way to anesthetize his patient's teeth. And the science of cataphoresis, or of instilling ions on a surface with an electrical current, was taking off. Dr. Wright had bought one of these things at great cost and little use from a traveling salesman. So he said, "PB, why don't you take this and work with it?" Well, PB, whose room was a veritable laboratory by this time, he had chemistry retorts and electrical gadgets set up. He took the thing home and got the thing to work. And basically, it wound up being a sponge electrode placed outside the jaw, and then the cocaine, which was used as an analgesic, was instilled into the patient's jaw with an electrical current. And it worked very well. PB worked with Dr. Wright, and it did work on the patients. Nobody screamed, nobody died, but nobody knows what happened to the cataphoresis machine after that. He actually came up with an idea for a horseless buggy. It would be driven by a power chain off of a separate battery. He made a diagram of it, but never built it. He worked for the Old Dominion Construction and Telephone Company, and this is when telephones were not particularly the most reliable. And then the business went broke. They owed PB and the employees $50 each for a month's worth of salary. So PB took some of the electrical equipment with him, $50 worth, went to Mr. Smith, the supervisor, and said, "Why don't we do an exchange? I'll cancel your debt if you cancel mine." And Mr. Smith said, "Fair enough." After that, he went to work for Ma Bell, and he was a lineman and worked out on the electrical lines. And at this point, he knew he was going to go to college. So he entered Richmond College in 1897, studying math, history, Latin, and English. Entered Hampton-Sydney in 1898. And it was the fourth oldest Presbyterian school in the U.S. It was founded in 1776. Only Harvard, William and Mary, and Yale are older than Hampton-Sydney. And these conditions were Spartan. He lived on the third floor, and there was no elevator, no running water. You had to go outside in the snow on a regular basis to haul buckets of water up 3 flights of stairs. And as a result, nobody wanted to go to church, which was about half a mile away, on snowy Sunday mornings. So he set up a Sunday school class in his dorm room so you could do pajama church. This is not a concept new with COVID, folks. Sorry, somebody was doing this before then. And but he did go regularly to hold a Sunday school class for the black community. And a fun fact was that he organized basketball as an actual sport at the college and organized this sport with other colleges. So therefore, he pioneered basketball being made an official intramural sport in the state of Virginia. And the Hills had been strong Baptists, but the Bernards were very staunch Presbyterian. And 2 years before his wife's death, Robert Hill Jr. joined the Presbyterian Church. And PB was 19 at the time, and he made his profession then and there and became a Presbyterian. He had a ministry at Hampton-Sydney. They didn't believe in letting their ministerial students lag, so they were sent out during the summers. And he was sent to a place called Tom's Creek, which is a tri-point, very similar to Four Corners, where Kentucky, Virginia, and West Virginia came together. And it was a very rough area. It was a mining community. The Virginia Coal Mine Company ran the place. It was a company community. And PB would go down into the mines with the men. He would eat lunch with them down there. He would even help out a little bit. He would listen to their stories, and he would follow them back at the end of the day, back to their homes that were very shabby, to say the very least. And he got to know them very well. Next slide. And there he is in his athletic days. He's on the first row, your far left. And he never did too much with football. He did kind of injure his hip, so that kind of put him off football. But he was, as I said, very conscientious about basketball. Next slide, please. And we can go to the next slide after that. And the next slide. Next slide. And he believed it. He believed that in the Great Commission, it was not only a personal relationship with the Lord, it was the commitment to spread the gospel. And he was deemed to have a calling. His pastor thought that he might have a calling. And they had sent him out first to one of the state penitentiaries, and he said he was given a tract on the Pauline journals. Oh boy. He didn't know what to do with it, and he just said these seasoned miscreants were sitting there looking at him, and he said he wandered more through that presentation than Paul did throughout his entire 3 journeys. However, the next episode was a little bit better. Next slide, please. Next slide. And he did win. He was a medalist for a notable medalist society there in Virginia, and he wrote poetry, and he had written essays. Next slide. Next slide. The Virginia and Coke Company. Abingdon Presbytery had paid him, and he preached at the company church, and initially that attendance was very sparse. But the next Sunday, he had gone down to the mines, and then he came up and ran into a baseball game that was being played by some of the young miners of a Sunday morning. And he got involved with their baseball game. And I mean, he caught the ball coming out of home plate, threw it to first base. And after that, the miners were, oh, this guy actually can play ball. We need to start checking him out. He also distinguished himself with them. He had an old horse that was given to him by one of the miners. And this horse was not gentle. PB got on it, and he said it was an 8-second rodeo ride with no time limit for the rider. But he managed to stay on the horse, and he said after a while, we got on very well. He settled down, and we actually had a very pleasant relationship thereafter. I can't imagine it, but anyway. He graduated in the summer of 1902 from Hampton-Sydney, and in the fall he went to Union Theological in Richmond. You can go ahead and, next slide, please. Next slide. And he continued the book room that he had developed at Hampton-Sydney, at Union Seminary. Basically, he was in debt. And he found out where he was spending most of his money on, so he got the people at Hampton-Sydney to give him a room, and he stocked it with books, stationery, paper, pens, pencils. And that's how he kept himself afloat. And he continued summer ministry by going to Bologna, Clayville, and Genito. He earned his Bachelor's of Divinity in 1905. And was licensed by the East Hanover Presbytery. And his first call was to the Chattanooga suburbs of St. Elmo and Lookout Mountain, and those churches are still very much alive, well, and thriving. In 1906, his first son, Sam, was born after his marriage on June 1st of 1905 to Miss Ella Lee Thraves. And St. Elmo's and Lookout Mountain were not large enough to support their own pastor, so he'd gone as a combination pastor. But under his guidance, they both grew to such an extent that they could each afford to call their own pastors. And he didn't want to give up one to go to the other. So he answered a call to Lynchburg, Virginia. And it was much influenced by moonshine and John Barleycorn, and had a very rough side of town. And he found a group of boys. Again, this is PB's his method. This was part of his method. He would find young people that didn't have anything else better to do, and he would create something good for them to do. He organized the Rivermont Football Club from a group of boys that were just hanging around the porch of a grocery store and were kind of contemptuous of everybody. But he got them, he got the church to give him a room that was back of the parsonage, fitted it out as sort of a hangout place with books and magazines and chairs and a checkerboard, if I'm not mistaken. I think he put out a checkerboard for them. And then he went out and he said, would you be interested in forming a football club? And they said, yes, we would. And so that's how the Rivermont Football Club came. And idle young men that had hung about aimlessly had a great direction. Then he answered a call to Roanoke. The West End Presbyterian Church had not yet been formed, so the first services were held in PB's home. And 2 months later, a church building was started back of the parsonage. And 2 months after that, the church building was finished. 2 years after that, the West End Presbyterian Church had been built. And they were extraordinary years with great prosperity. In 1912, in August of 1912, my mother, Martha Evelyn Hill, was born to them, their third child. In the meantime, PB had picked up on the furor that was brewing in the country throughout. I mean, there were tales coming back of the East And World War I was not yet starting, but it was in the offing, and there were rumbles of revolution in Europe, far beyond the Russian Revolution. But even so, those years were years of great discontent. And he heard a missionary who come back from Korea, and they were crying for people, and PB got, the Holy Spirit laid it on PB's heart. He rushed home to Mrs. Hill and said, Queenie, he called her Queenie, Queenie, we've got to go. We just have to go. We have to go. And right now. And she said, Bernard, it's the middle of the night. Must we go right now? He said, no, darling, no, we can wait. But so they applied to the Presbyterian's mission board and were accepted. And in November of 1912, they boarded a train for San Francisco. PB, Miss Ella, Sam, John, and Miss Martha. And they went to San Francisco and were to cross on a ship called the Shinyu Maru. And its route was to be Honolulu, Yokohama, Kobe. And at Honolulu, this ship was really great. It was like the Titanic. It was very high end, very, the people were very educated aboard this, people who were traveling this route. Very well-educated Japanese, but even so, militarism was starting to rear its ugly head in that country. Remember, this is after the 1905 Battle of Port Arthur, Russia. And it was a terrible battle that lasted for 6 months. And the Japanese were able to conquer the imperialist czarist troops. And it was too bad because this was what gave Japan the idea that its spirit warriors had won the day when it was really not. The Meiji Emperor had a friend who was an intimate of President Theodore Roosevelt, and Theodore Roosevelt was the one that negotiated that surrender and that will. But it got into the eyes of these common troops. These were not samurai troops that fought at Port Arthur. This was a lower, more common class of people, and they did not have that same concept of Bushido that the old samurai warriors had. And they got this idea that it was Japan's spirit and they could march over anything. And you see, PB said that he saw these little kids on the shipboard marching with broomsticks, regimental caps, and they were very into this whole concept of discipline, marching and drilling, marching and drilling. At Honolulu, they had a bit of a scare because Sam went missing, and they had pulled away from the dock, and PB went up and spoke to the captain. The captain said, okay, we're coming about. And along about that time, one of their helper, Ah Wing, showed up with Sam with a big lei around his neck and eating pineapple, even down in the engine room, eating pineapple. It took them, they had a very pleasant voyage to Yokohama and then transferred to another ferry that was going to take them to Kobe. This was quite a different experience. It was not a fine liner. They had to sleep with rats. The bunks were laid out so that they were just along a central corridor. There were no proper cabins at all. Mrs. Hill was sleeping across the aisle from some Japanese person a man that she didn't know, and she thought, great, this is wonderful. And the mattresses were very dirty and vermin-riddled, and the food was deplorable. So, when they got to Mokpo, they landed at Mokpo, which was a 10,000 inhabitant city. It was on the port. And there they were met by the Nisbets. And they had run the Mokpo mission, which had been built in 1898. And there PB spent the large part of the first year with learning the language. Korean is a very complex language. There was the Confucian Chinese, and then there was High Korean. There was the Korean that was used with officials, There was the Korean that was used with children, and then there was the language that was used with menials, servants and lower class people. They then went to Gwangju, which at the time was 5,000 people. I'm sorry, could you give us the next slides? There he is at the time of his graduation. Next slide. And that was my great-grandmother, Miss Martha Catherine Thraves. Next slide. Next slide. We could go through pretty quickly. And there they are at the time that they left for Korea. And there's PB, Miss Ella, and the boys, and Miss Martha. And then you can, next slide. Now this is important because this was after they came back from Korea. And she was a beautiful woman when she left, but you could tell it was a third world country, and you're going to see why in a little bit. You could see what it did to them. Next slide, please. Oh, that's PB's baby sister. Next slide. There's PB, and there's Sam. Next slide. Oh, next slide. The slides of Korea are further down. If you could flip through them, Mr. Gonzalez, keep going. All right. Just keep going through those. That's the Shinyu Maru. Next slide. And there they are with Ah Wing. Go ahead, next slide. And there they were. That's when they landed in Mokpo, and they used those carts as transportation. And then there's a slide of a local religious festival. And religion in Korea was either Buddhist or shamanism. And its religions were mostly of the shaman animist nature. But these places were very primitive, as you can see. They just had these little mud thatch-roofed huts that consisted of 2 rooms, each 8 by 8, called kan, K-A-N. There were no paved roads. It was all dirt. Next slide, please. And those are monuments to ancestors and deities. Next slide. And there are some more of the gods they worshipped. And that's part of the animist. That was part of shamanism. Those were some of the bodhisattvas. Next slide. Again, you can go, keep going. Here he is with the local pastors. Keep in mind that the job of the visiting missionaries was to educate and preach the word, look after the sick in clinics, or go out to the homes and minister to the sick, and then to church plant. Actual pastoral work was done by these local ministers. Next slide. And there they are with a tent that was set up. And this was interesting because this all happened during Japanese occupation. It's after the first Sino-Japanese War. This is the second Sino-Japanese incursion. Garrisons were around, but they had not fully penetrated. However, there's this one story of how a lieutenant sent around to PB and Mr. Ko, his assistant, and said, "I need to see you now." And PB told Mr. Ko, he said, "Well, tell the lieutenant we'll be happy to stop by and visit with him after supper." And Mr. Ko said, "No, the lieutenant's messenger says we are to come now." And PB was no little perturbed by this, but he kept his temper, and he said, "Tell the good lieutenant we will be by after supper, period." So they went to see the lieutenant, and he was a fussy little man, and very filled with his own self-importance. And PB told him, he said, look, I am here to preach the gospel. We have a license from the Mikado of Japan, so to do. Now, if my tent is on a property that it should not be, we will move it in the morning. But I'm holding service tonight. Thank you very much. And so the lieutenant backed off and said, oh, there's been a terrible misunderstanding, blah, 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 blah. And the next day, the captain, who had been absent during this exchange, showed up at PB's and told him, he said, apologized for this intrusion, and said, regrettably, Japan's policy has tightened, and it is becoming more difficult for missionaries to come to Japan or its territories. But this just shows PB's persona. He just would look at you, and he had this ethereal quality about him that I suppose that the Lord gave him, and his aura went before him. Next slide. More tent revivals. Next slide. And there you can see the men in their dress. They had baggy pants, and then they wore a short jacket over this, and then a long coat that tied over the heart. And the ladies had a skirt that came up under the armpits, and then they wore the chokadi, which was a short jacket that came down just above the waist. And you see the gentlemen with their hats. And they revered their hats like most Hasidic Jews revere their kippah and the big hats that you see them wearing. Those hats were absolutely sacred to them. And sometimes they were legacies and passed on from father to son. Next slide. And there's PB with some of the native workers. Next slide. Next slide. Oh, go back one if you would, please. These people are lepers. You can see the loss of digits and toes, and you can see the damage to the face. There is a picture that I did not include in this original series because it is it's too disturbing. And besides, we're going to eat lunch. Next slide. Next slide. Keep going. And then this is the Mokpo mission. And those are the Nesbits. And you can see it's a fairly well-developed, there was a developed mission. There was a school for boys for 250 boys and 150 girls. And it had thrived beautifully. And there again, you can see some of the ladies. Next slide. These houses were of an amazing construction. Now, PB and Miss Ella had the brick residence. They were heated by flues that were led from the fireplace throughout the house. So this was floor heating before we ever thought about it in the States. Next slide, please. And there he is teaching them, playing baseball with them, showing them the game. Next slide. Again, another, okay. Next slide. They had been hard at work. It was very difficult to get from A to B, and PB would ride. He was a circuit riding preacher. And he went into the countryside, and there were no paved roads. People would give you different landmarks, but that was it. And it didn't take long to get derailed. And there was always wildlife, wild boars and tigers. PB desperately wanted to hunt a tiger and did try to track one on 2 different occasions, but the occasion never presented itself. He never could find the beast, and he had stopped just before a large expanse of tall yellow grass, and he thought, I've been at this long enough, I'm going to go back home. When he got there, a Korean believer said, thanks be to God that you turned back. A Japanese military man was killed there last week by a tiger that jumped out of that yellow grass. So he missed his opportunity to hunt a tiger. But he did hunt boar, and that was part of their meat that they lived on. And they had a large garden, and they planted corn and peas and cabbage and soy and potatoes. They were able to grow potatoes over there despite the poor soil. But somewhere in the spring of 1916, Miss Ella developed, PB had started having lead cap headaches, and so did Miss Ella. It was decided that they were suffering from a toxemia from the teeth, and it was a chronic infection. Oddly enough, the children didn't get it. And it turned out that Mrs. Hill also had anemia, a profound anemia. So there was no dentist, a Western-style dentist that they would go to. There was one that was in Mokpo, not in Gwangju. They would have had to gone back to Mokpo. And he was a dentist, all right, but he was a person of ill repute, very ill repute, and I'll leave it at that. So at that point, PB consulted with the mission board, and they decided that he should come home for a while. So they packed up, they closed the house in Gwangju, packed everything up. Coolies carrying 300 pounds on their back for an 8 or 10 hour day got them to Mokpo. And as they were coming into Mokpo, because they had to catch the train line back to the west side back to the east side of Korea. And they were waiting for the train. The coolies had dropped their load, and they were eating their rice. And PB was going, but the train's coming in. And he said, not to worry, Honorable Shepherd, there will be plenty of time. And they were right. The train took its own time to get in there, and they got everything the coolies had plenty of time to get the hills and everything loaded onto the train, and off they went. When they arrived at the port city, they went to the U.S. consul, because by now the First World War was in swing, and Japan and Britain were at it. In addition to the European powers, Britain was at war with Japan. When they were coming over to Korea, the Hills had not needed any kind of passport. Now they needed passports. And the only way you could get them was through Washington. The U.S. consul was adamant and not terribly helpful, and said he said, how can we do this? We've sold everything. We're here. I've got a wife and 3 children. He said, basically, too bad. And it was very unsympathetic. And so then PB had a thought. He said, we're going to be sailing on the Empress of Russia, which is a British ship, and we're going into Vancouver. We're on British territory. To cross the Pacific, we will be landing in British territory. Please, would you give us a letter of introduction to the British consul? Well, I'll do that, but I can tell you he's not going to help you. We'll see about that. So off they went to the British consulate. The man received them with great courtesy and great deference, and was most impressed to hear about their story and how they had come to Korea and their work there. He was very empathetic, and he said, we can get passports for you in no time. The whole thing took 40 minutes. He had passports for all 5 of them. And they went back on the Empress of Russia. They were in a typhoon going back, and it's amazing, but they made the run from Yokohama to Vancouver in 11 days, typhoon and all. So that was the first time that they had been back in the U.S. in 4 years. They went from there back to Virginia, and they bought a 600-acre farm, and again, the old bromide of fresh air and sunshine and hard physical work worked wonders for PB. Miss Ella was doing better, but never really quite the same. And he had a pastorate there in Roanoke again. And then he got a call to Louisville. So he decided he was going to go to Louisville. And it was a very interesting experience because this was where he first found out about the Northern and Southern Presbyterian divide. In Korea, everybody had kind of gotten on, the Northern Presbyterians in the North and the Northern Methodists, they got on fine, and if somebody came down from North Korea, the northern section of Korea, to the southern, more Presbyterian section, the Methodist became a Presbyterian, and vice versa. It was all, all one, no big problem. Here it started to be a problem. You had the Warren Memorial Presbyterian Church on one corner of Louisville, and then you had across the street, you had First Church, and it was Southern Presbyterian. The Northern Church was richer. Now, Louisville was a rich city to begin with, but the Northern Presbyterian had more money at the time, and some of the richer Louisvillians wanted to join up with the Northern Presbytery. And Dr. Sproul Lyons, who had been a former moderator of the General Assembly of the Southern Presbyterian Church, found it just too difficult to navigate, and he answered a call to First Pres Atlanta. And he told PB, he said, "Go with God. I wish you Godspeed on this." He says, "This is an untenable situation." But PB found a solution. He said, "Okay, those who've wanted to go to the Warren Memorial, fine, they've gone. Now, we can expand." So they joined up with another local Presbyterian church, and the place thrived. And in the meantime, now, all of this is getting back to the General Assembly, and they are beginning to look at PB. They had noted his record as a student at Tom's Creek and at Bologna and at Genito, and then his work at founding the West End Presbyterian Church in Roanoke, his Korean missionary work, and now he took a difficult situation in Louisville and turned it into this wonderful community of faith. And this is getting into 1921, and PB was starting to want to go back to Korea. Can I go? Can I go? They said, well, let's look at this. And they had their physician, Dr. E.S. Allen, look at PB and Miss Ella. And Dr. Allen said, well, PB is in good enough shape to go back, but Miss Ella really is not. And he said, I don't think she ever will be. And he said, moreover, there are still no good dentists in Korea, and you are going to wind up with the same problem that you had before. And you're going to have this issue. You're going to wind up having to come back. Miss Ella may not survive it this time. So it was decided that his talent was too great to be wasted on Korea, and they were going to keep him stateside. And at that point, Messrs. Jarrett and Weekly. Mr. Jarrett was an elder in this church. Mr. Weekly was the moderator of the Board of Deacons. And they came up to offer him the call here to First Pres and said, please tell us what you can, that you would come be with us. And PB thought about it, and he talked it over with Miss Ella, and she said, well, Bernard, I think you need to go down there and have a look at it. So he did. And Mr. Jarrett held this huge reception at his home. And among the guests was Bishop Theodotus Samuel Capers over to Christ Church and over to Christ Episcopal. And he gave a wonderful speech about, this is a great town. You should take up your brother's call. It's a fertile field, and it's wonderful. And so PB and Miss Ella decided that they would make the move. And they arrived in July of 1921 during the height of summer. So PB started right away, and he came down here, and they were living in Kerrville at the time. And this part of the trip was very interesting because Miss Ella felt she took advantage of the opportunity for long overdue sleep. And the rest that she richly deserved. PB started right away with his work here at the church. First thing he did was to get the church to give him an office in the Majestic building. The church rented him 3 rooms and gave him a secretary. He needed it for peace and quiet because he was always being interrupted at home and here. There were people coming to make calls. There were people who just clamored for his attention. He was never going to get the work done. He started a men's Monday lunch, whereby the men would gather for prayer, lunch, and compilation of a list of prospects to be personally visited. And that's how, with a lot of personal attention, but no big revivals, no lotteries, no lavish, gaudy spectacles, they had a huge congregation in a very short period of time. And he had started a men's club, a civic club. And his presence downtown was for very specific reasons. Not only did it give him that private space, but it showed that a minister could be an active part of the business community, which he was. There were only 2 other civic men's clubs in town. He started another one through this church, and they were members of the congregation, but they were not necessarily interested in that particularly. They were more interested in providing social services for those less fortunate. Club lasted about 4 years when other civic organizations began to grow, and they closed after a while. He had a recreation room in the basement of this church for 3 years, and it was to accommodate the lunch hour from 11:30 to 1 of the young ladies in the secretarial pools downtown, and also the students at Drawhan's Business College. Remember Drawhan's? And then he found that in 23 that the church needed to expand the facilities here. And that's when they added on the educational wing, office wing, and they even put up the famous 1,250-seat rooftop tabernacle for summer services. And the work prospered here to such an extent that he began thinking, we're going to have to move out of this building. We still can't accommodate everybody. It's time we allow the church to really grow in terms of planting. When they had moved here, there were only 3 Presbyterian churches. There was Westminster, there was Utica, and there was Pine Street. Pine Street was east of Southern Pacific. Utica was up north, sort of up north, like more north into Almas Park. And then you had Westminster on South St. Mary's to accommodate those people who lived between Houston and the river. It was time to move the church in a different direction. And he came up with a council concept, which was very interesting because he thought of the council as a holding company. And it would nurture, and there would be representatives from each of the planted churches on this council until such time as they could stand on their own 2 feet, hire their own pastors, and formulate their own budgets, and then they would be released to fly on their own. And this worked very well with 5 of 6 churches that they started. They started a church in Prospect Hill, but because of the way real estate was expanding, it was really, really hard to keep that part of town sedentary, as it will, or stable in one place. People moved away, and the people at Prospect Hill found themselves in a similar situation with the Pine Street Church. So Pine Street and Prospect Hill closed, and they merged with Westminster. But you had the Utica Church was sold, and its monies were sent to build the new building at Beacon Hill. And Beacon Hill did so well that it later on started Leon Springs Presbyterian Church. There was Leon Springs, and then they had Harlandale, Crestholm, Highland Park, and Alamo Heights. For years, the only church that was within strike of Alamo Heights was the Methodist Mission half a mile down Broadway, which became the old Alamo Heights Methodist Church. Long before the Methadome, it was a lovely Gothic church that was next to the First Broadway Bank, if memory serves, or very close to it. But these churches all sprang up under his leadership. And PB desperately wanted the concept of the council to continue, that each of these churches would start a council of their own and continue growing churches outside of their church. However, it must be noted that because Presbyterians are very individualistic, it's very hard for them to be too trustworthy of centralized power. They couldn't see that. They said, Dr. Hill, this is great because you're doing it here, but who's to say that the people who come after in these other areas will be as forward-thinking as yourself and want to push other churches out from the mothership, as it were. So the council concept died, and it was too bad. But of the 6 churches that were started, 5 grew and thrived, and they not only started Beacon Hill not only started Leon Springs, but there was another church started in Woodland Hills in the years after PB's retirement. And the only other church, I think, that was started by the Northern Presbyterians in Los Angeles Heights. Still is a Northern Presbyterian church. PB had a radio ministry, and he had asked the church to build him a studio in 23. But the Southern Electrical Equipment Company had come along and said, we are planning to have a huge station in connection with the San Antonio Express and News, and we would love for you to join with us. So he did. And his broadcasts went out, it was the 3rd Sunday of April of 1923 in the sanctuary. The first ever radio cast of PB sermons went out over the airwaves. He reached so many more people with radio than he ever could have reached by staying here in this church. And he was one of only 8 nationwide. One person, of course, in North Texas was the famous Dr. George Truett out of First Baptist. And then the only one who had continued really long-term preaching was Reverend Cadman out of Brooklyn, New York. There were others here and there, but George Truett and PB in the north and PB in the south kept radio ministry alive and well. And from Yellowstone to the Yucatan, they heard him. And in fact, there was one day, people in Honolulu heard him. They heard it was, for whatever reason, it was just that clear, and the transmission was picked up, and it went from Honolulu to Singapore. It went from Honolulu to Singapore, and they don't know why. It's just one of those things that happened. And he continued his radio ministry long after he had retired here. And he made his radio recordings up at his study at Hunt, Texas, where he finally took up residency. The day he retired, finally, from First Presbyterian, Mayor Maury Maverick declared it PB Hill Day, and it was a citywide holiday. And everybody came out. There was an enormous reception at the Gunter, and it was the one where Mrs. Hill was in the frilly dress as an older lady, and PB was in a white suit. But there were 1,000 people that showed up to that. And it was a marvelous occasion of rejoicing. Everybody came. The current Catholic Archbishop at the time showed up with great praise for PB and his work, and Reverend Bishop Arthur Moore at Travis Park, Sam Capers from Christ Episcopal, and Rabbi David Jacobson. PB had known Rabbi Frisch when he was there, but it was David Jacobson that he took to his heart. I'm convinced that I've looked at photos of Rabbi Jacobson, and he looked so much like PB's brother, Forrest. All of PB's brothers died between the ages of 59 and 61, and he had very little contact with them. Sadly enough, because they became businessmen and had lives elsewhere, he went to the ministry in the mission field. But his broadcasts, his pamphlets are still around, and we're working on hopefully resurrecting some of the wonderful tapes on which he gave his sermons. Thank you all so much for your time and your listening. I'm so glad that you all came to hear a little bit more about this wonderful gentleman. Thank you. Yes, this is it. No. I don't have the one with the cover. That has the cover.
Quick questions. We have, if you're not hangry yet. Any quick questions?
No, but he got good. He didn't do that. But there is a gun story related to this church, and he got practice for that the night the Japanese lieutenant's messenger came, because he told him, he said, "We're coming," and he said, "We'll come after supper. And if he doesn't like it, and if he shows up here with a regiment, I'm going to take my double-barrel shotgun and I'll kill every one of them." He really told him that he wasn't going to put up with any kind of rubbish. And so this is the famous story of the gun here. There were two drunk cowboys. At that time, where the Griffiths Chapel was the Carillon Tower. We had carillons and bells and everything. It was a bell tower, and that's where everybody came in. Well, these two drunk cowboys who'd seen way too much activity on the west side came riding into the sanctuary on their horses. And the board of deacons were rushing around trying to restrain yeehaw, yeehaw, trying to grab the horses. And PB pulled out his six-shooter, and it was an open carry. He just pulled it out, put it up on the pulpit, and said, "With the help of Almighty God and this weapon, I intend to hold divine service. Now you gentlemen are welcome to join us. If you will kindly hand off your mounts to our deacons, they will see you seated properly." And they got them all. And you can imagine the noise, because there was no carpeting at all. And I'm from the generation that remembers the old purple carpet that had paisleys on it, and it was threadbare by the time I got here. And I don't know if that was the one that was there or not. And underneath was wooden floors. And that's what the cowboys rode in on. This church didn't have carpeting for years. And it was just wooden floors. Can you imagine the noise? Yes, he was. Governor Moody appointed him in 1923 to Company B, I think it was, down in Falfurrias. Could you imagine driving all that way? Because he did ride with the men. But because he was a pastor, Captain Sterling said, "Reverend Hill, we know that you have a church. Therefore, you do not have to be with it. You don't have to bill it with the men, but come to us when you can." He said, "You just call if you're forming a posse, I'll ride with you." And he would go out with them. And the Rangers have had a different tradition. It's not just the Texas Rangers, it's the Rangers from the Middle Ages. They were single, they were a very solitary group of men, taciturn beyond all belief, not terribly friendly, and they were they were not above finishing you off if you gave them a real problem. And they were used as vigilantes. And this is how the Texas Rangers were. One riot, one ranger. And they had such a history of roughness that the governor thought, this gang of men might benefit from the smooth talk of the Virginian. Because PB was, in his preaching, he was not the menacing kind of preacher. He was not a wheedler. He was not a honeyed tone preacher. He was conversational. And his voice, the brilliance of his voice was the fact that he had a wonderful voice anyway, but when he was working those years ago on those creaky old telephones that were so difficult to adjust, and you had to have them, somebody had to come out to the house once or twice a week to adjust them, he had learned the right timbre, the right delivery, the right speed, and because of his knowledge of sound, he was the perfect person to deal with people who were agitated. And he learned to be very calm. And Captain Joaquin Jackson of the Texas Rangers said that he Joaquin learned great psychology from PB, because PB was able to get people to tell him stuff. He would just sit down and talk to them. And he could get criminals to tell him what they'd done. And he didn't have to use any kind of tough tactics at all. And Captain Joaquin learned his technique from PB, and he often credits it. But yes, the Rangers of today have a very different attitude than the ones of former years. And it was because of my grandfather's Virginian manners and everything. He said there's a better way to do this. And this was why he was able to be friends with so many people in San Antonio government. Regardless of which political party they were with, they just thought PB hung the moon, because he could present an argument not in a sense of a contentious thing, but in the sense of two different ideas that were completely different and could be presented to where you could come up, there would be thesis, antithesis, and a synthesis. And it was a very spiritual application of Hegelian dialectics. I don't know if we have that opportunity or occasion anymore.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you for getting him here.
Oh, I wish I had.
I always, when I read and hear about previous pastors, and I go into the room in the library and the pictures and the stories, I don't know how they did any work in the church because of what they were doing outside the church. But then I realized that what they were doing outside the church was really work of the church. And I don't know, I think that we are approaching that in some ways with what we're doing with the homeless and what we're doing in the city. And it maybe we don't need to separate the pastoral duties between what you do inside the church to what you do outside the church. And that's what I'm always encouraged or challenged by that.
It's always thinking of the church as a tabernacle and not
Yes.
a four-sided building.
Yes.
You want an open air. The Hill Country Cowboy camp meeting that he started, that tabernacle, it's open air. The breeze goes through it, whether it's hot or cool. It's open air. And you take your work, as you said.
So maybe that's the concept that I need to work on, that when I'm in the streets, but I'm also pastor to the streets. And that's the way I felt when we were doing Loaves and Fishes, and when we did the things in the parking lot. So thank you again, and I guess it's clear that he did bring his gun to church.
He did bring his gun to church.
Because when I was here and interviewing, and after I got hired, and they told me there were 3 things I couldn't bring to church. Couldn't bring alcohol, couldn't bring tobacco, and I couldn't bring my 6-shooter. Unless I maybe hid it in my drawer or something. But and alcohol and tobacco aren't a part of me, but I do have some 6-shooters that I would not bring into church, but I have shot. But I've never shot at anybody. So thank you again.
Thank you. I would like to thank you and Dr. Bob Fuller and Scott Simpson and Paul Gasher and John Kaiser, and thanks to Hank Cherry and Mr. Gonzalez and Miss Robin for their help this morning.
Yes, well, we're happy to have you. She'll be here for lunch. Not sure which table she's going to sit at, but let her eat, but take advantage of communicating with her along the way. Let me pray, and we'll have lunch together. Father, we're thankful for the ministry of P.B. Hill and for his fingerprints and direction in the formation of this church, and for how we have become what we've become as a result of all of the pastors that were here previously. Thank you for Anna and her willingness to come and share, and just pray that you would open up our hearts and minds to know and understand the influence that this church has had in this city for 180 years. Thank you for our time together today. Pray that you'll be with us around these tables. Ask your blessing on the food that we will share together, and pray that you would bless those who prepare it and those who serve it, and give us sweet fellowship. And we lift up Agatha's daughter, who will be in surgery on Monday, and we pray for them and their family. And we pray for the families that have been involved in services to celebrate the life and the expected resurrection of their loved ones this week. Go before us today. Give us an understanding of your grace and peace, and pray that you would walk before us in everything that we say and do. In Jesus' name, amen.